Hey everyone. Hey, welcome in. Welcome to Antisocial Studies, my YouTube lives. It's AP World Wednesday. And tonight we're going to be reviewing units 3 and 4. So come on in, say hi in the chat, tell me your name, tell me what questions you have, what you want to know about units 3 and 4, or just general questions that you have about the AP exam. For those of you who are new, my name is Emily Klenkler. I'm an AP World History teacher in Austin, Texas. I also do AP World reviews and classes with Marco Learning, and I've been doing these lives every Wednesday. So if you're new to this one, you can go back and watch the old ones. I've gone over test-taking strategies. I've gone over units 1 and 2. Obviously, in the following weeks, I'm going to be going over the later content. So, hey, come on in, say hi in the chat, let me know who's here, and thanks for joining. Hey, Natalie. So, let's figure out what the heck is AP World 1450 to 1750. Hey Tracy, hey Vivian, hey Marian. So this is like there's a big marker event here, right? Like I'm not super big on memorizing a bunch of dates, but really this time period, there's kind of two events that start this time period. The first is going to be 1453, which is when... So the first one is 1453. That's when the Ottomans conquer Constantinople. So it's like the end of the Byzantines. So it's sort of the final end of this era where we still had sort of a Roman Empire to some extent. And we still had a Christian-like empire in the Middle East. The other reason why it's right around 1450 is obviously going to be 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Columbus's discovery in big air quotes. So this is, this is like a huge shift. If we're talking about change and continuity over time, this era is arguably when we see the greatest change from one era to the other, because we discover that two whole continents exist and they get incorporated into all of our conversations about politics and economics and cultural diffusion, all that good stuff, and some bad stuff. So here's really the key. Here's the way I want you thinking about the broader narrative of this class, because I know it's a lot. It's a lot to keep track of. So I like to kind of give you a few common threads, right? In unit 1, right? So over here we're in units 1 and 2. And it's like land-based empires are supreme, right? So you have these huge land-based empires. These are going to be, right, it's going to be your Song dynasty, it's going to be your Abbasid, your Delhi Sultanate, Mali, all that good stuff, right? And you do have some sea-based kingdoms or empires. You have like the Majapahit, you have the Swahili coast, but they're mostly like city-states. They're not really full empires at all. I mean, they might have a tributary system, but... what's happening then is land-based empires are not becoming less important, right? So we still have powerful land-based empires during this time period. These are now going to be like the Gunpowder empires, right? This is also going to be like the Manchu in China. It's going to be the rise of Russia. But what's happening is that we have this rise of sea-based power where they're becoming equal to these. They're kind of starting to catch up, right? This is first going to be like Portuguese, kind of down here, honestly, like on the way is like Portuguese trading posts, empires, and like the Spanish Americas, right? That's like kind of the first step. And then by the time we get to the end of this era, we're really kind of at this apex where we have like the British Empire, the French, French Indochina, like that sort of thing. And so again, what's happening is that the big question for this era, it's really two things. It's like what changes are happening because of this rise in sea-based power. And also always that question should be, and what changes are not happening, right? Like, so there's a lot of things that are actually staying pretty similar, right? The other question is going to be like, how are these land-based empires responding? And are they responding? Are they noticing what's going on? Are they getting the memo, right? Because what's going to happen in this next era, which will be next week, is like full-on imperialism in these land-based empires, right? That's when like we're going to have the Ottomans falling apart, when we're going to have Matthew Perry forcing Japan open, the Opium Wars, right? So that's what's coming, right? We're from the future, so we know what's about to happen. So this moment right here of 1450 to 1750 is really kind of the turning point. And the question is going to be, who's getting on board? Who is seeing what's going on in the world and seeing like, you know what? I actually think control of these seas is going to be really important. And I also think like having a lot of access to like money, gold and silver might become as valuable or more valuable than land. And the states that get on board with that are going to then be successful here. The states that don't are going to get addicted to opium and fall apart. Spoiler alert. All right. So with that, let's just take like a broad look at what we're talking about. So there's Unit 3 and Unit 4. Unit 3 is kind of like Unit 1 again, where it's just sort of roll call, but it's even weirder. Ooh, I hate Unit 3. I hate the way they organize Unit 3 because all it is just like, hey, we still have a bunch of land-based empires, right? Like Unit 1 was a bunch of land-based empires. We kind of talked about what they were doing in the song and whatever. Unit 3 is the same thing. They're like, okay, the Mongols sort of wiped the slate clean in a lot of Asia. And now we have new land-based empires rising out of the Mongol ashes. And so the question is like, how are those land-based empires, how are they expanding their control? How are they administering their empire? Meaning, how are they like maintaining control? And then there's like a lot of religious chaos during this time period. And that's really it. And so again, when we're talking about these land-based empires, we can really focus in Afro-Eurasia, right? I mean, obviously we're going to talk about the Americas a ton, but that's more the focus is more in Unit 4. So again, like this is another one of those where I don't actually really think the way that the AP exam has kind of been built and the way this has been built, like what they're telling us that you need to be able to do is compare. And actually in this unit, they didn't even split it up by region. They literally just said, how are they expanding? How are they maintaining power or administering? And then what's going on with the religions? And they didn't even say like, topic 1 is in Asia, topic 2 is in Europe. So I would say Unit 3 is a unit you can somewhat de-emphasize. Like as long as you have some basics about, you have what are the Gunpowder empires doing? What are some unique ways that they're kind of expanding their power and their influence? And then move on and spend most of your time reviewing Unit 4. In general, and this is just my take, and every teacher might have a different opinion on this, but in general, the way I view this curriculum is that the even units, like Unit 1, Unit 3, wait, those are odd. I teach history. The odd units, Unit 1, Unit 3, Unit 5, are sort of like, they're like context. It's like setting the stage of like, okay, what states are here? Who's here? And then the even units, Unit 2, Unit 4, Unit 6, are them interacting with each other, which is way more valuable and shows up way more often on the AP exam. So I would kind of always, at least in those first 6 units, I would spend a lot more time on the even units where it's like, right, Unit 1 was like, okay, what's going on in the different regions? And then Unit 2 was like trade routes and interactions and like putting them next to each other. Same thing here. Unit 3 is like, hey, there were still land-based empires. They were still really powerful. But then Unit 4 is like, okay, well now how's the whole world interacting now that we've discovered the Americas? And I think the reason they did this is just because we do have a tendency, especially in the West, to just think like as soon as it's 1492 that Europe just like takes over the whole world. And that's very much not the case, right? So the 3 questions you're going to want to be able to answer. How did land-based empires expand? The simplest answer is gunpowder. That's the simplest answer. Now there's other things too, but like really, you know, we would consider these Islamic empires, we kind of call them the gunpowder empires. And that's partly because, right, the Mongols before them, they kind of took gunpowder from China. They came and actually kind of spread it around. And then these empires, so obviously China's had gunpowder for a while, but these Islamic empires are the first that really use it in a widespread way. Like they have entire sections of their army dedicated to like artillery. They're really the first ones to do that. And this is one of the ways they're able to gain and conquer a lot of land, right? The Ottomans go all the way up into Eastern Europe, kind of mimicking what the Mongols did. The Mughals actually for a while control almost all of South Asia, which is really difficult, right? These are great questions in the chat, by the way. I see what y'all are asking. And so really the simplest answer of like how they're expanding is through gunpowder and through new technology, right? Obviously, you know, in Europe, we're talking about kind of expansion via maritime trade and like conquest overseas. The other part that plays into the expansion is that a lot of the expansion in this era is fueled by religious conflict, which kind of goes into like the third theme, right? And so like the Safavids in modern day Iran, kind of, are Shia, And then the Mughals and the Ottomans are Sunni. And it's a lot more complicated than that, right? But like, you know, for our purposes, basically, they all kind of believe they are the ones who have inherited the caliphate, Dar al-Islam, right? After the Mongols, there's this kind of fight of like, well, who's now the true Islamic empire? And so a lot of expansion is going to be fueled by these religious conflicts, but they're fueled by like interreligious conflict, right? Like within Islam. Whereas the last unit, we had like the Crusades and stuff. It was like Christianity versus Islam, or Christianity expelling the Jews, or whatever. This is like within the Islamic world. And then of course in Europe, it's within the Christian world, because this is the era when we have like the Protestant Reformation and a lot of the religious wars of Europe, trying to decide like, are we Protestant, are we Catholic, right? Let's see. And I think I actually misspoke, Cami, that like, I don't think the French conquer Indochina in this time period. It's like either at the very end of this or in the early of the next era. So I think that was my bad. One other way states are going to expand that we shouldn't forget is like by capitalizing on the rising power of Europe. So you have these different African trading states, the Congo, the Dahomey, the Ashanti, that are going to capitalize off of the growing need for enslaved people, for enslaved people from Europe. To get involved in the slave trade themselves so that they can gain power. Keep in mind, right, like we view this today as like, why would they, you know, go against, you know, their other African people? They're all different states, right? They're all different states. That'd be like asking, why would England fight a war against France? Like, they're different, right? So they're like, hey, if we can gain power and influence and guns and other things and also get rid of our enemy by selling them to, you know, the Europeans, then that's sort of a win-win from their perspective. Now, of course, by the end of this era, it's going to become it's just going to decimate the continent. But at the time, a lot of these states really feel like, well, hey, we've been negotiating with like Arab traders for a long time to trade enslaved people out to the Indian Ocean. So how is this any different? Again, we're from the future. We know that it's different. We know that the empires the Europeans are setting up are going to be way more complex and way more long-lasting. But like they don't know that at the time, right? Okay. So let me see. The other one, and then I'm going to come back to some of these questions. So how do rulers legitimize and consolidate their power? This is the era of like grand palaces and imperial portraits and that sort of thing. And if I'm being totally honest, like the AP exam is obsessed with like visuals from this time period. They are obsessed with showing you like a portrait of Queen Elizabeth with like the burning of the Spanish Armada behind her, or with showing you Versailles or the Taj Mahal or something like that. So I just would expect that somewhere on the test, there's going to be a picture of Versailles or a picture of like a Qing imperial portrait or whatever, because this does seem to be the era. Like what's changing is that from the last era, there was a lot of like monumental architecture, but it was mostly to glorify the religion. So you had like the Qutub Minar in Delhi, where they took the ruins of a Hindu temple and rebuilt it to be a mosque and minaret. Or you have Angkor Wat, which was a Hindu temple and then a Buddhist. That sort of, you have like the mosques of Mali that are built out of like mud and whatever. So there was that. But now what's changing is that a lot of the monumental architecture and the art is specifically just to glorify the state, right? So one of the major themes of this era over here in like, especially in Europe and Asia, these bigger empires, is that the ruler of each place, whether that's the king or the sultan or the emperor or the czar or the whatever, is that during this era, they are doing everything they can to take power from the traditional elites for themselves. We call that like consolidating power. So we can think of it most clearly in Europe, right? In the medieval era in Europe, and yes, these presentations I'll post on my website, which I'll put actually in the chat right now. So what's happening is that if we think about like late medieval Europe, there were kings, but like real, like day-to-day stuff, like they were not that important. If you've seen Monty Python, right, there's the whole joke of like no one even knows who the king is. They're like, who are you? He's like, I am your king, right? They're like, okay, I don't know who you are. Because it's like, it's all about like your lord. The local nobility is really the one you see and that has control over your life, right? So what's happening is coming into this new era is kings and queens are trying to grab and consolidate power in as many ways as they can. And that's happening in Europe. That's happening with the czars, just like the creation of the position of czar is like building power from the different princes. In the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, the Ming, they're all doing that. They're figuring out ways to say, who are the traditional elites, whether that's the nobility or whatever, and how can we go around them? How can we make more of a connection from like the regular people straight to us and like cut out this middleman of these traditional elites? And so some examples of that would be, that was weird. Some examples of that would be the janissaries. So this process in the Ottoman Empire, which is shown in this portrait here, which I see a lot. So like, I don't know, just look at it for a second. I wouldn't be surprised if it showed up on the AP test. This process of devshirme in the Ottoman Empire is kind of a weird one because it's terrible, but it's also a really unique thing that's happening in this time period where the Ottoman sultans kind of don't trust a lot of the traditional elite soldiers. They're like the cavalry on horseback with the big curved swords. They're like, they have a lot of power and influence around the empire. And so when the Ottomans start conquering non-Muslim places, because in the Quran, a Muslim cannot enslave another Muslim. When they start conquering like Eastern Europe and it's Christians, what they do is they start enslaving like the Christian sons of these families. They say, you kind of have to pay tribute by giving us one of your sons. He's going to come to Constantinople. He's going to be taught Islam. He's going to become Muslim, right? He's going to be educated, and then he's going to become part of my bureaucracy in some way. So if you kind of like go to the lower schools and you don't really show a lot of promise, you might become like a foot soldier, or you might become like a kind of bureaucrat, like a lower bureaucrat. But then you can go up into the elites. You can actually become like the vizier, like the advisor to the emperor, or you could become a janissary, which is going to become the part of the Ottoman military that controls the guns. So hello, that's a lot of power. And so this is a really great example of a leader like the Sultan trying to get around, trying to circumvent traditional elites by being like, hey, what if I bring these conquered boys in when they're pretty young, brainwash them, teach them to be loyal to me, the Sultan specifically, and then put them in positions of power so that they're like thankful to me. Right? I mean, it's like terrible, but it's also this weird social mobility. Like it's a strange system. We also see that with Versailles, right? The whole point of Versailles is to build a palace where all of the nobles can come and live with Louis. And it's like on the surface, it's like, wow, you're so lucky. You got an invite to come live at Versailles. But what's really happening is Louis just making sure that all the nobility are literally under one roof where he can keep an eye on them, right? And he can be like, I don't want any of you chopping my head off. It's like he knows. It's like he knows what's going to happen to his grandson, great-grandson, right? The other thing, too, is that, like, of course, he doesn't just build a palace. He builds frickin' Versailles, right? Like, Versailles itself is a statement of the king's power, of, like, I can do whatever I want. I am the Sun King, Louis, Sun, S-U-N. I am the absolute monarch. I am the state. And, like, if I want to spend all the state's money on this insane palace where then you're all going to live and, like, dress me in the morning, then, yeah, that's what I'm going to do, right? The same thing, interestingly, is happening in Japan. This is the era when the Tokugawa shogunate becomes a thing. And they do the same thing. They have a thing called alternate attendance, where the shogun is like, hey, nobility, this like daimyo, you're going to keep your estates out in Japan because it was like kind of feudal. They're like, but you're also, every other year, you're going to come live with me in Edo, in Tokyo now. And they're like, isn't that so nice? You're going to come and live with me. But what is actually happening is, one, now the elites have to pay for 2 households, which is very expensive. So it's draining them of a lot of their money and power. And it's also removing the feudal lord, from their homeland for a year at a time. And it's sort of like holding their family hostage because their family, I believe, stays in Tokyo the whole time. So it's like, hey, don't rebel against me, former warlords. I'm now the shogun, right? Ooh, that's a great question. Karina, I legitimately forget what the millet system is every year. That's not a joke. So if someone remembers what the millet system is, throw a definition in the chat and then I will tell you if that applies. There are certain things that I have like a mental block for that every year I go look it up and every year I'm like, oh no, what is that again? Right? Okay. Finally, we have religious conflict, right? So we have the Protestant Reformation. Look at this dude, Martin Luther. He looks like he'd be really fun at a party, right? This is really a challenge to the extreme power of the Catholic Church that had reached its height by the end of the Middle Ages. And then we're going to see a series of religious wars for really the next like 300 or 400 years in European history. It's the 30 Years' War, the whatever years war, all of those things. On the right, we also have Sunni Shia wars. So this is, I can't remember whether it's the Ottomans or the Safavids, but one of them are these guys, and one of them are the guys with their heads on pikes. So, you know. So the really like the Ottomans, their biggest kind of enemy for most of the time is actually like Shia, like other Muslims, but Shia Muslims from the Safavid. Every once in a while, they'll fight against Europe as well. And then in the middle, this is an example of syncretism happening during this time period. So this is the man who's kind of credited with creating Sikhism, right? S-I-K-H, which is a blend of kind of like Islam and Hinduism. That's oversimplified, but it's kind of a blend of a few of these religions that come from South Asia and the Middle East. And so if you want to look for an example, like in last unit, we talked about how a great example of like cultures diffusing would be the language of Swahili, right? Like Arab traders come down, settle on the East African coast, Arabic mixes with Bantu and makes a whole new language. This is like a whole new religion, a whole new belief system that comes up, mostly in kind of northwestern India, where and Pakistan today. So anyway, syncretism is still happening. Oh, they gave limited autonomy to non-Muslims, but interesting. I think in general, like the Ottomans, for their time period, were relatively more tolerant than other groups. So I do think the millet system is like an example of that tolerance, but with caveats, right? So in the same way that like, you know, you get tax benefits, right? If you're a Muslim, but still it's like they're tolerant to others. Now, I want to be really clear. The Ottomans are not tolerant to everybody. They commit terrible atrocities too, but it's like they are more tolerant to other religions in their empire than other groups. For example, when the Jews are getting expelled from Europe throughout a lot of this time, they get openly invited to come to like Constantinople, right? The other question is like, do the nobles know this is happening? Yeah, they do. But now that the king has gunpowder, right? Now that the king has a military with gunpowder, and especially if a king separates himself, he's not a king, but if a king separates himself from the Catholic Church and is now the head of a new religion like Henry VIII. So if you're Henry VIII, then you're like, hey, I could just like protest, become part of this Protestant Reformation and make a new church, the Anglican Church. And now I'm the head of it. And all of a sudden overnight, all the land that was owned and run by the Catholic Church now goes to the king, right? So what's just happening is this has been a slow build that's been building for a while. You know, it's not like something that happens overnight. But like, yeah, the nobles are looking and going like, they know why they're being invited to live at Versailles. And there's a lot of them that are like, who cares? This is great. Like we get everything kind of paid for. We get to like live this great life. But again, this is also the era when by the end of this era, you're starting to have some little glimmers of enlightenment where some people are like, this seems like a lot of power, right? So, okay. So again, that's really, Unit 3 is just establishing that there are like traditional practices of empire building are continuing. The only other one I didn't really talk about is like the economic side of it. So like in the Ottoman Empire, you have tax farming, which Mr. Freeman does a really good video on this that goes way more in detail. It's kind of similar in my mind to the Mughal zamindar system. It's basically just a way to like delegate tax collection to local provinces. So in the Mughals, if you're named a zamindar, it's sort of like, great, you're in charge. You're kind of the official that's in charge of this province, and you're in charge of collecting the taxes for the year. And then it's sort of like you get a cut of that, right? So like, and then you get a cut of X% of however many taxes you collect. So it incentivizes them to get as many taxes as possible. It also, of course, leads to corruption, but it creates this like system across the provinces where at least the leadership in the provinces are grateful and loyal to the leader because they've given them this privilege where they can then also get really wealthy and become powerful. So again, we're constantly just doing this divide and conquer. Like, how can we delegate out, give some local leaders some sense of power and authority so they don't rebel against us, right? In England and France, they do that with systems like in England, the Justices of the Peace. And with the French, it's like the intendant system. Basically, in medieval Europe, right, justice was carried out very locally. And so it was up to the lord. Like the lord of the manor was the one who like declared the laws and made judgments, or the church, right? So in England and France, what the kings start doing, like in England, they appoint justices of the peace who very specifically are not nobles, or they might be they're like lower nobles. These are not the people who traditionally have a lot of power in the region. And they're like, hey, they are now my justice of the peace. They are meant to go out, and it's kind of like early lawyers and judges, right? Where it's like they're going to go out and they're going to carry out the king's laws in all the lands. And so again, it's another way to just spread your influence across your own state and make sure that you're really like maintaining and consolidating this power. Okay. But the more important thing is really like the discovery of the Americas, right? And how that, what does that change and what does that not change about all of these systems? And so let me just show you, according to the College Board, the main idea they want you to know from Unit 4, which is pretty broad, but is explain how economic developments from 1450 to 1750, which kind of just means the discovery and integration of the Americas, affected social structures over time. So what they're really going to ask you about is they're going to ask you about like, okay, how did this discovery change the economy, change like maybe the global balance of power? Like how did it give Europe more power, that sort of thing? But also this, how did it affect social structures over time? How is it changing social hierarchies or reinforcing social hierarchies, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit. So again, when we bring in the New World, you know, this is when we really get into like, okay, the trade and the interaction, that sort of thing. And so of the European empires, first of all, one of the continuities I want to make sure is really clear is that the Indian Ocean is still where it's at. Like everyone still wants to get here. Literally almost all of world history is people that aren't here trying to get here. Right. And so obviously like the age of exploration, like sending explorers out, the whole point is to get to Asia, because now these powerful gunpowder empires are in the way. You can't just like walk along a Silk Road or whatever. And they're like still a little pissed from the Crusades. You know what I mean? They're like, I don't know, maybe we don't want Christian traders coming through our land. So everyone still wants to get here. And so even when they discover the Americas, really the Americas are just going to be seen as like a bartering tool to get here. Like literally when England and France and the Dutch start exploring North America, their main concern for like 100 years is like, oh my God, how do we get through this continent? Like, we just want to get through this so we can get over to China, which is hilarious because of course North America is going to be like really valuable territory. But at first they're just like, we just want to get over to Asia. And again, if you're Spain, like the discovery of silver, you're just like, awesome, now I have something China wants and I can trade with China. So the value of this land is really underestimated. It's more seen as just a tool to get Europe on equal footing with like China and India, right? So in terms of European empires during this time period, the two you would want to spend most of your time thinking about are the Portuguese and the Spanish. So there's a few kind of eras of European kind of imperialism. And really like phase 1, which is like 1450 to 1750, it's this era, is going to be Portugal and Spain. And then phase 2, which is like, it's kind of at the end of this era, but it's going to be kind of around like 1600 to around 1800, is going to be more like, it's still Spain, and then it's actually not really Spain anymore. It's going to be Britain, France, the Dutch. And then phase 3 is going to be like the 1800s, which is really mostly going to be Britain, right? I mean, other states have a lot of power too, but mostly Britain and France. So there's like a few different phases and like rises and falls of different empires that are powerful. So during this time period, the Portuguese create a relatively unique form of an empire. Well, it's not actually unique. It's sort of what other places had been doing, but it's called a trading post empire, right? So the big thing is like they, thanks to Prince Henry's navigation school and other, you know, the caravel, other innovations, they start trying to figure out, can you go around Africa? This seems really obvious now, but they didn't know. They were like, does Africa go on forever? Is the world flat and will fall off the end? I don't know. They knew the world wasn't flat, but still. But they're like, how can we get around this? Can we get around this? And so they keep sending explorers out. They get further and further until eventually one rounds the Cape, and then the one who comes after him da Gama is going to make it all the way to India. And so from that point on, you have what's known as a Portuguese like trading post empire. And Portugal is a player in the Indian Ocean. They're not dominating the Indian Ocean. They're just there now. They are a new state, right? So there are still like the Omani Empire, right? Oman is kind of down here. The Omani Empire is incredibly powerful, right? And is like they're controlling, actually their empire goes all along what was like the Swahili coast for a while. You still have the Mughal Empire in India and other states around India that are going to be really powerful. You have the Sultanate of Malacca over here, right? So it's not like, I think a lot of us sort of imagine that like as soon as a European shows up somewhere, they just dominate everyone else. No, in this era, they're really just like showing up, right? But there's gonna be the rise of conflict between Europeans and especially Muslims in this region. So like the Portuguese and the Omani Empire fight a series of wars over who can control these trading states, especially along East Africa. So like the Portuguese are going to go back and forth. They are going to conquer like Malacca. They are going to take control of some of these Swahili coast states on and off. And there's basically a series of kind of wars and naval battles and competition over trading cities. But what's important here is that the same thing is happening, right? Like all of these, especially Spain and Portugal, but also England, like they're setting up trading posts, right? Where they are like setting up shop in a city, like a trading city along the coast. But what I want you to notice is like, they're not powerful enough to go into any of these continents. Like they're not nearly powerful enough. And so we start to see them taking over, you know, like Singapore or Malacca or whatever. But like they do not have the power yet, the European empires, to go into Africa and Asia, which were these big land-based empires. So they focus a lot of their attention on like, okay, well, it is easier for us to just fully conquer this territory. And then we're going to use what we have here to just like get our foot in the door. Next era is when we're going to start industrializing, and we are now going to have the power, we being Europe, to like go in, right? And like conquer these places and colonize and scramble up these places, right? So again, you really want to try to distinguish between the phases of imperialism because it can get confusing, right? You don't want to just assume that like as soon as they start exploring, it's like the scramble for Africa. This process takes, 400 years, right? Okay. Okay. So some of the main themes. How did trade and labor systems change and stay the same? They grew and became more complex, but really the form of them did not actually change that much. So when we're thinking about trade, one of the topics that comes up a lot, which is just the best way to see the new kind of globalized economy, is the global flow of silver. This was like a DBQ about 10 years ago. It's just all about the global flow of silver. And so you can sort of just see the mechanics of how the economy is working now by tracing silver. Before this, the only real source of silver in the world was Japan. So it was like incredibly rare, and the Chinese really liked it. And then the Spanish discovered 2 huge silver mines. And by huge, I mean like they're still being mined today. They're essentially bottomless, right? It's like in Peru and in Mexico. And so they have indigenous people working in these mines. In Peru, they continue the Mita system. They continue that Incan Mita system. It just becomes way more brutal. It's not about like, hey, come serve your community and work in the mines. It's essentially slavery, right? And then that silver goes first, this is important, to a European, like a place where the Spanish control. So either it goes back over to Spain or it goes over to Manila in the Philippines, which is one of the first places the Spanish conquer because they're like, hey, we need a base to get to Asia. And so the key here is that it's not about like, hey, we're going to trade straight from Mexico with whoever wants it. We have to go through then a more formal like place where the Spanish control. This is one element of mercantilism, which is growing during this time. Then from there, the mother country trades it wherever they want. So in terms of trade, you really have to understand what mercantilism is. And it's like way more complicated than we explain it, but it's really, really, really important. Because think about it this way. And it's kind of like devious. Now, I'm going to make it sound like there's a bunch of evil European dudes being like, how can we conquer the global economy? Which is, of course, not the way it works. But in effect, this is what's going to happen. Before this time period, land was power. It was like, who's the most powerful? It's who has the most land and who controls the most people. And so you were like, well, you could tell that like China was very powerful. Whoever controlled the Middle East was very powerful. If you were like the Holy Roman Empire, you were whatever. And like money, currency was a means to an end. Currency, like paper money or even coins or whatever, was just a way to get other actual valuable goods. Right? A dollar bill is meaningless. A dollar bill is useless. You can't eat a dollar bill. But like before this time period, having money was not, you didn't want to keep that money. You were using it to then get silk or get something else that you needed. And what's going to change in this time period is that the Europeans are going to start to compete with each other over like how much money you have. How much gold do you have? How much silver do you have? Because that becomes a stand-in for like, hey, well then with that, we can go buy whatever thing that we want. Now, this seems so obvious now. Like it seems so obvious now to be like, oh, money's power. But no, like that's made up. Money's made up, right? And so this is the era when the Europeans are like, well, you know what? We don't actually have these huge land-based empires. So how can I tell whether the English king is more powerful than the Spanish king or whatever? Like it's hard to tell in the same way. And so they start competing with each other over just like money. How much silver do you have in your treasury and that sort of thing? And so this is a big part of mercantilism, is that you can gauge, there's like a competition to have just the most gold and silver. Not to like control necessarily the most land or the most people, or it doesn't even matter what you then do with that, it's just having it, right? So this today is like when we rank countries by GDP or something. It's like, what does that really mean? Well, I don't know, we've just decided it means that they're powerful. And the other element of that, of course, yes, Cami, I agree. The more you learn about history, the more you're like, everything's made up. Society's a prison. Nothing's real. And so like the other thing that they do is they're like, okay, well, because that's so important, we need to control trade, right? I mean, think about it. In China, the government wasn't controlling merchants. They're like, I don't know, if a merchant wants to go across the Silk Road and trade with a Muslim and then, I don't know, fine. What do I care? You know what I mean? I'm worried about like farming and making sure my people can eat. But now the Europeans are like, well, you know what? Like this is actually a way we can gain power and influence. And so we're going to control every element of trade through mercantilism. If a company wants to go, they need a royal charter. Hello, Dutch East India Company and British East India Company, right? Or if like a conquistador discovers a bunch of silver, hey, that silver mine belongs to the king. And now like you're all working for me, and the silver actually goes through the king, right? And so this is something really new. And again, at the time, it's really just amongst the Europeans. No one else is paying attention. They're like, isn't that cute? It's like former medieval European states, and they're competing over silver. Meanwhile, China's like, we have all the actual things. India and Southeast Asia are like, we have all the actual things that you want and that you need. You know what I mean? Like Africa's like, we have the enslaved people that you need. Like we have, so they feel like they have the power. Of course, we're just from the future and are like, no. Don't go into the basement, right? Because we know what's going to happen. The other big thing is like labor systems just expand and get way more brutal, right? So slavery had existed before this era. Indentured servitude, serfdom, all those things existed before this era. They just get way more complex and way more brutal. And so this is the height or the low point, right, of coerced labor. Like just the whole global economy being run off of some form of coerced labor, right? And so the kind of lesser examples of that would be first like indigenous labor, which is essentially, right, like they set up, for example, like the encomiendas, which are kind of like feudalism. It's like, hey, I'm going to give you some Spaniard, you're going to be an encomendero, you have this chunk of land. You can use the indigenous people there however you need to, but you need to like make them Christian and like kind of care for them, just keep them alive, right? And then that turns into the hacienda system, which is basically the same thing, except that the indigenous people are not technically tied to that land. Like they can leave, but like where are they going to go, right? So there's that, but obviously indigenous people are dying off. I mean, throughout the Americas, there now historians estimate that around 90% of the indigenous population died within the first, 50 to 100 years of the conquest. So like that lasts for a little while, but then those indigenous people are mostly gone. And so you also first, at least in North America especially, the preferred method was indentured servitude, right? So if you're a poor person in Scotland, if anyone's seen Outlander, this is what Jamie does in Outlander. But if you're like a poor person in Scotland and you want to come to the New World because you're like, well, I'm not going to really make anything here. There's no land for me here, but you can't afford it. You would go to someone who can afford it and is going to the New World and say, will you take me with you and pay my journey? And then I will owe you my labor for X amount of years. And you draw up a contract. But the problem is, at some point you have to free them. And they also kind of become a little bit of a threat because you free them and now they can kind of compete with you. And so the method of coerced labor that they land on is chattel slavery. And I want to take a second to just make sure that we're really clear on how chattel slavery from Africa is different than the other forms of slavery we've seen. It's different in really two very important ways. One is that the enslaved people are viewed as legally and morally property, right? And so whereas before, like go back to the Romans, there was slavery in Southeast Asia, wherever. Yes, there was slavery and you might be enslaved for life, but you were still seen as a human being that was enslaved. And so you still actually had some basic rights, right? You might have even been seen as like part of the family. Now, did the enslaved person feel that way? Who knows? But the point of this is like you were still seen as a human being. That goes away with the transatlantic slave trade. They dehumanize the enslaved people to where they're treated like legally they're basically cattle, which is why that's where chattel comes from. It's from the same root. And the other thing that's really new is that it's racially based. This is something a lot of people don't realize, is that race gets invented in this era. Race gets invented in this era. Like ethnicity had always been a thing. You were Arab or you were Germanic or whatever. But this idea of like race based on the color of your skin, that you can look at the color of someone's skin and be like, you're white, you're black, you're Asian, you're whatever. That gets invented now. Like the phrase white people did not exist until the 1500s. And it was because now they're coming into contact with non-white people and having to kind of figure out and justify like, well, okay, we're not going to enslave people that look like us, white people. We are going to enslave people that look like that. And so this is the first time in human history that slavery is based on race and the color of your skin, right? Before that, were most enslaved people black? Yes, a lot of them came from Africa, but they weren't enslaved because they were black, right? They were enslaved just because like this was sort of the system that the Africans had set up. You weren't allowed to own property. So one of the ways you could gain wealth in Africa was to own other people as like part of your like enslaved population. Okay, I'm going to get off my like little rant about that. I just think it's really important to know. Okay. So people are talking about like, you're struggling with like memorization and that sort of thing. Here's the deal is that I want you to notice that I have actually said very few super specific facts this whole time. You know what I mean? Like I actually haven't said very specific things. And really the vast majority of the test is about these big ideas. And it's about just being able to explain these big ideas in a way that makes sense. And then being able to point to like a thing, a development, an event that proves your point. Right? And so if you get an SAQ that's like identify and explain one change to labor systems from 1450 to 1750, you could be like, one change was the rise of chattel slavery. This changed because previously enslaved people were seen as human beings with some rights, but now enslaved people are seen as property, like in American plantations. And you move on. And so the bigger thing is the general idea and development. Here's what I will say. If you're worried about memorization, I would suggest that the only thing, or at least the first thing you really focus on memorizing is the different eras and then some of the main states that are in that era. Because a lot of other things you'll kind of get your memory jogged. So like I have these maps on my website. I would, if nothing else, memorize not every single state, but be like, okay, if they say 1450 to 1750, I would go like Gunpowder Empires, absolute monarchs in England, and like New World. And that then would kind of jog my memory for these other things. Because if I can then remember the New World, I can then be like, oh, right, Columbus. Oh, right, the Columbian Exchange. Oh, yeah, slavery. Oh, yeah. And it sort of jogs your memory for the other things. So I would start with the top down. Start with the most broad. If nothing else, I would just know the 4 eras so that you can, on the day of the test, if you're taking it on paper, you could literally, like, when you get the test, just write out really quickly. Just have a little thing for yourself of like, okay, 1200, 1450 is Song and the Abbasid and the Middle Ages and the Aztecs and the Inca. Boom, right? And then a lot of other things, you just have to sort of trust that you've been doing the work. So like sitting down and just memorizing every single fact or event or person is not actually going to help you as much as making sure that you really understand the big processes of what's going on so that you really actually know them. You're not just like memorizing them. And then, you know, you can point to one specific thing if you need to. But keep in mind, like, you're never going to have to, like, they're not going to give you an essay or an SAQ that's like, discuss the rule of King Louis XIV, or like discuss even like the ways that various French monarchs, blah, blah, blah. Like, they're not going to be that specific. And so you don't need to actually go through and memorize every single fact or even a lot of facts. What they're going to do is they might ask you, like, identify and explain one way that states use monumental architecture to legitimize their rule in this time period. And then you could be like, one way was the Taj Mahal, right? Or one way was Versailles. And then you just sort of explain that thing. So again, you need to know some stuff, but it's you get way more bang for your buck if you really instead focus on like, okay, do I really understand kind of the main narrative of what's happening, which is what I'm kind of trying to go over. And then you can just like fill in the blank with some specifics that you don't even have to really know a lot of details about. You just have to know like, oh, and this is an example of that thing, right? So don't worry too much. Ooh, can I make flashcards or a presentation of these breakdowns of what you're saying? Maybe if I have time. I don't know if I'll be able to, because I'm making a lot of stuff, but if I have time, maybe. I do have like some review packets and stuff on my website. They're like stuff for you to fill out, but you know, those might be helpful. One of the other things that, you know, they talk about in this era is just understanding that like whenever a new place gets conquered, can we please just realize that like those people don't just disappear? Yes, in the Americas, a lot of them die of disease, but there's still millions of them left. And like when we talk about slavery, like the enslaved people didn't just willingly get onto the ships. And so it's really important from a history perspective that we understand that there was resistance, right? And so this is another example of like, do you need to know every single example of resistance in the New World? No. I would know like 2. I would know 2. I would pick 2. I would maybe pick one that's successful and one that's unsuccessful. Or I would pick one that's rebelling against in North America and one that's in Latin America. Whatever you want, right? But it's like, if you're not sure, right, you could be like Metacom's War is one in New England against the New England colonists. Or the Pueblo revolts. Or slave revolts, right? Like slaves running away, that sort of thing. My favorite, my go-to is Queen Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica because she was successful. She actually carved out a little maroon town for her and other escaped enslaved people that the British just formally recognized. You have over here with, Anna Nzinga over here who's kind of fighting, actually she's down here in like Angola. She's fighting against the Portuguese kind of for sovereignty for her state, meaning like there were African leaders who saw what the Europeans were doing and was like, this is going to be bad. Like, I'm on equal footing with you. I do not want you coming and just totally taking over my country. The King of the Congo very famously writes a letter to the King of Portugal that's like, hey, the slave trade is like really destroying the people of Africa and you need to maybe like chill a little bit, right? So there is resistance going on. And again, you don't need to know all these things. I would pick 1 or 2. And even if I say like, hey, I'm going to pick Queen Nanny's going to be one of mine, I don't need to know her whole life story. I just need to know Queen Nanny was, we think, an escaped slave in Jamaica, and she successfully fought against the British. That's it, right? Because I'm not going to be asked to write a whole essay on Queen Nanny. I might be asked to write an essay on like resistance to colonization. And then I'm like, okay, well, I can tell you a little bit about Queen Nanny, and I can tell you a little bit about enslaved people on plantations and how they resisted through Christianity and running away and all those sorts of things, right? Yeah, Queen Nzinga is awesome. And yeah, that letter from the King of the Congo to Portugal is like a pretty classic AP World document, right? It's just sort of like I feel like you have to turn in your AP World History teacher card if you don't have your kids read that letter. So again, I know it's easy for me to say, like, don't stress about memorization, but like, you know, there are things to stress about. I would stress more about, like, do I actually understand what's going on? Because the memorization is kind of useless if you don't really understand what it means. If you're just going through and memorizing and you don't really get the bigger narrative, then it's like, it's all just gonna like go out of your brain. So it's better to understand the big narrative, right? And I'll kind of try to do a little bit of that in the last 5 or 10 minutes. I just want to make sure I get through. Okay, here's the other big one, because they've told us, right? They've told us that in this unit, their main focus is like, how are social structures changing? So obviously social structures can be like labor systems, slavery, that sort of thing. But it's also social hierarchies. And so here are some of the best opportunities to talk about this. Okay. One is the casta system in Latin America, right? Which is this like ethnic hierarchy in Latin America. Right? Do you need to know all the interworkings of it? No, I did my graduate degree in Latin American studies and I don't understand it fully, right? But it is just a really complex ethnic hierarchy where lightest skinned people are at the top, people who were like born in Spain or Portugal, and then darker skinned people are at the bottom. And that you have different rules and you have different rights depending on what caste you're born into. And it's like put on your birth certificate. So it's like certain castes and below can't own guns. Certain castes and below can't wear certain colors of clothing. Like there's all these different things, right? And so this is probably the most in your face example of like, whoa, a completely new social hierarchy being created, right? And manufactured for the benefit of the Spanish and the Portuguese. The other big one that's happening during this time that I think is really interesting and is going to be important for later is the rising middle class in Europe. That's the other one. This picture here is showing the first stock exchange in Amsterdam. And so one other thing I want you to think about, same with like mercantilism being a new thing and money as power being a new thing. Well, now if money becomes power, I mean, think about in medieval Europe, the way you had power was if your dad had power. And the way your dad had power was if their dad had power. I mean, you had to be born into the nobility, and that's how you then owned land. And so if you were not born in the nobility, you were just out of luck. There was not really much you could do to gain power. You could join the church. I don't know, it's like kind of it, right? Now, though, there's this new opportunity where you, because the state wants to produce as much money as possible. And so the state is going to actively sponsor people to go out and try to create money, make money, right? They're going to be merchants, they're going to be investors, that sort of thing. And so you have the state, the king, actively sponsoring that because, by the way, this is another way for them to take power from the nobility, right? If you're the king of England and you're like, some of these nobles kind of think they're almost as important as me. And it's like, well, they have their noble titles. I'm going to leave those alone. But what if instead I start funding these like charter companies? I don't know, like the Virginia Charter Company and the whatever, right? And then it's like they're grateful to me. They had their royal charter and any of the wealth they get, I get a cut of it, but they're also really grateful. So not only is it helping the European economies grow, but it's also a way for the absolute monarchs to gain power. And so you start to have these opportunities, especially for second and third sons of the nobility, right? Because they had this thing called primogeniture, which meant that the first son inherited all the land. And so you have these like wealthy second, third, and fourth sons who are like, well, I have money, but like, I don't want money. I wanted my father's land, but I couldn't kill my brother or whatever. So now I just have money. And so now they're looking around like, well, now I have a way to invest it. I can invest in a colony in the New World. You can go and found a colony and name it after yourself, or name it after the Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, and call it Virginia or whatever. And you can invest in plantations, and then you could get other people below you to run those plantations. And all of a sudden, you are a really powerful businessman, even though you control and own no land, really, at least in England, right? And so this rising middle class, which is going to be known eventually as the bourgeoisie, is such important context for everything that's about to happen in the next era in Europe. Because this is what's going to fuel industrialization. This is what's going to fuel the Enlightenment. This is what's going to fuel a lot of the revolutions, like all of this stuff, right? And then this over here is just showing like you do still have the kind of traditional hierarchies. Like in France, you still have the 3 estates. So there are still some leftovers of this nobility at the height, that sort of thing. But again, one way social hierarchies are changing is just the very top, the absolute monarch is kind of separating themselves. So whereas before in the social hierarchy, it was like a triangle, and it was sort of like, okay, up here is like the king and his nobles, and down here is like everyone else, right? So this is the king plus the nobility. Oh God, it's gonna look like a 3rd grader did it. Okay, king plus nobility. This is everyone else. Now what's happening is that you have, instead, you have the nobility, and then you have the middle class, and then you have the king who's just like up here. The king's just out of it completely. Divine right to rule, right? Like, I'm an absolute monarch. And so that is changing as well. A social hierarchy can change by being totally disrupted or just being really clarified, right? Like, oh, now we really know who's on top. Yeah, so Karina, feudalism is still active in this era. Yes, you're completely right. Feudalism sort of just peters out until it's not useful anymore. So, I mean, if anyone has seen Downton Abbey, like feudalism lasts until the 20th century, right? There's lords and then there's the people. Now, there's not serfs, but like the idea of like your local like landlord, that's where that word comes from. We call like the people who rent us our apartments landlords because it's a feudalism, right? And so it's still active, but it's just becoming less productive. So you don't really have serfs tied to the land anymore. Too many of them died in the Black Death. And then now they have too many opportunities to like run away to a city and have better opportunities. So you still have feudal relationships, but that minoralism has sort of gone away because now you have trade and the rise of like market villages and then eventually cities. So it's more just that it kind of slowly dies off in a lot of European states. And again, yeah, the last one, serfdom is going to stick around in Russia until the 1860s. And I remember that because Russia emancipates its serfs the same decade we emancipate the slaves, and the same decade the Japanese end the samurai system. So like in the 1860s, which is the next era, right, is like all of these new rising states are like getting rid of this old sort of traditional form of labor and hierarchy. Okay. And just a reminder, right, that like the point of this era and the whole point of doing Unit 3 is that don't get totally caught up in Europe and the Atlantic world, because still everyone's wanting to trade with, by definition, the most powerful empires, which is China and India and the Middle East, the Omani Empire, the Muslims, that sort of thing. It's not going to be until the next era that Europe is on top, right? So if we go back all the way to like this first slide, right? Like we're still here. Europe is still trying to catch up. Next era is when it's basically going to become like a snowball, right? The mercantilism and the cash and money fueling merchants is also going to fuel innovation, which is going to lead to industrialization, right? It's about to snowball, and Europe is about to like literally take over the world. Okay, I'm going to skim back through the chat and make sure I didn't miss any big questions. And thank you for those of y'all who are helping out answering questions in the chat. This is really, really helpful. Let me see. So, yeah, I'm seeing, again, most of the questions were just in general about, can you talk about Russia, that sort of thing. Really, the big thing about Russia is that they just are a thing now. I know that seems kind of silly, but it's like, they just exist now. They didn't exist before. So in the last time period, they were just like, it was like the Kievan Rus. It was just local princes. There was no actual Russia. And then in the last era, the Mongols came and conquered and set up a thing called the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which is the best name ever. And that out of that, so at the very beginning of this time period, one of those local princes named Ivan is going to rally the other princes and be like, hey, if we all unite together, then we could, like, if we start to unite all these princedoms together, we could like stop paying tribute to the Mongols. Right? We could all together say, we're not going to pay you tribute anymore. We're our own thing now. And so they do that. And he becomes the first czar, Ivan the Great. Right? And so again, that's like Russia is basically born just as a resistance to the Mongols. And so I'm not really good on the years of like when they start to conquer all this land, but just understand that for really most of history, when we say Russia, we really just mean like this. You know what I mean? Like this part is going to be important when we get to Japan and the Cold War. But like up until the 20th century, when we say Russia, you should really think of it as like the European side of Russia. The Asian side of Russia is not going to really come into play until, like 20th century. War with Japan and then the Cold War. The Ivan I'm talking about is Ivan the Great. Ivan the Terrible is his grandson. And he, like murdered his kid and stuff. So he's not great. After him, they set up a dynasty of the Romanovs because they're like, that family line didn't seem to do very great. So, let's see. Other ways to study and to review. So again, I think that the best way to study and review is two things. I think it's to work your way down in terms of, big ideas from each era, working your way down to a few specific examples. And then I also think, and I'm going to pull up, actually, I think I can just pull up a whiteboard. Yeah, I'm going to do that really quickly. And I'm going to stick around. I'm probably going to go like 10 minutes over. So I'm recording this and it'll be on my YouTube if you're like, I gotta go. But like in general, what I would suggest is you start by just being like, okay, here are the different eras. Ugh. And you sort of have a basic understanding of like what's in each of them, like what's happening in each of these eras. And then you kind of start slowly working your way down from there. And so like my first step for reviewing would be like, okay, can I go like 1200 to 1450 and can I list out a few states? Can I get my brain into that era, right? And so I'd go like Song, Abbasid, like Mali, Aztec, Inca, medieval Europe, and then I'd be like Mongols, right? And then I'd be like, okay, can I do that for, and then I might say like, and now what are the big themes of this era? The big themes are like land-based empires plus technology, and then like regional trade routes, Silk Road, etc. Those are like the big ideas. I'd just be able to jog my memory so that when I get to questions that say like in 1200 to 1450, you can have something where you're like, okay, let me situate myself in this era because it gets confusing. Then I'd go to the next era and be like, okay, can I do that for this one, right? So 1450 would be, Spain and Portugal. It would be the Gunpowder Empires. And it would be like, then the big ideas are going to be like the New World, like Columbian Exchange, and then rise of, or like introduction of Europe into Asia, right? Just like trading and that sort of thing. Then I'd go, and we'll just go ahead of ourselves a little bit, right? But then I'd go to 1750 and 1900 and be like, okay, well now we're talking about, political revolutions, right? So we're talking about like the American Revolution, etc., right? And we're also talking about the Industrial Revolution, and we're talking about European empires. Like those are the big things here. And then again, the main themes are going to be like industrialization leads to imperialism. And then also like how do big Asian states respond? So going back to like these gunpowder empires, how is China responding? Not well. How is Japan responding? Really well. The Meiji Restoration. What's Russia doing? They're emancipating their serfs, right? And then 20th century is just you go full chronological. Right? When you get to the 20th century, it's not really thematic anymore. It's like, okay, well, now I just need to know what caused World War I, what was the result? What caused World War II, what was the result? What was the Cold War and how was it fought? And then like, what's decolonization? And what are some examples of it? And that's it. This is the course. This is the whole class. And then from within that, of course, it gets way more complicated, right? You're like, okay, well, back in this earliest time period, land-based empires are like, encouraging technology. So you'd want to know a few examples of that, right? The Song and like paper and printing and gunpowder, or the Abbasid and the House of Wisdom. Like, so again, that's what I mean when I say you work your way down from broad to specific so that the last thing you're studying is the very specific like flashcard example, right? So if you can on the day of the test, like take 3 minutes and be like, okay, like formulas, right? For a science test or a math test, like you would just write down a bunch of formulas. Like if you can just do this and be like, okay, I can now put my brain in the era I need to. And then you just have to sort of trust that your other reviewing has been working, right? So I would be watching Heimler's history videos. What I would do is I would also go through the course and exam description. Let me show you what that is, if some of you haven't seen this before. I know I shared it one other time, and this is where I'm getting these learning objectives from. Literally, you go to Google and you do AP World course and exam description. Clearly, I've searched for it a million times, and there's a PDF that just pops up right here. It's free and open. It's like, this is not cheating. This is the document from the College Board that tells us, like, here's what you need to know. And you'll notice it's like 260 pages. So please do not just like read this whole thing. What I would suggest you do is you do like a Control F and you go to like 1.1 and you'll get to a part of it that looks like this, that's kind of in detail. And this tells you like, okay, well for 1.1, here's what you need to do. For 1.1, we need you to be able to explain the systems of government employed by Chinese dynasties and how they developed over time. And then they give you a hint with these historical developments. So you're like the Song dynasty of China, which used methods of Confucianism and imperial bureaucracy to maintain and justify its rule. Now, what I would do is I would use this CED as a checklist. Like I would literally just read those statements. And if that jogs your memory and you're like, yeah, okay, I feel like if I really needed to, I could talk a little bit about Confucianism, then you're like, check. And then you just move on to the next one. But then if you reach one, like let's say you're scrolling and you get to like, I don't know, this one, let's go down to the one we just talked about. Like, let's go down to like 3.1 or something. If you get to one that like, you're just like, oh my gosh, I have no idea. Kind of got to like search around. It's a little bit annoying, but again, use Control F. It's so much easier. Come on, 3.1. I believe in you. Oh my gosh. This is so annoying. So let's say you're going through and you read one of these learning objectives and you read the developments and you're like, I don't actually really know what they're talking about. Like they're using words I feel like I've never heard before and I'm really unclear about what that means. So let's say, right, you get to finally, oh my gosh, 3.1, empires expand. And you then say, okay, I'm going to read through this thing. It says, how and why various land-based empires developed and expanded. Well, it relied on the increased use of gunpowders, cannons, and armed trade. Okay. It included the Manchu, the Mughal, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and it led to rivalries and conflicts between states. If you're like that, okay, I kind of remember that. Great. I might go like look at a map or something, but I feel pretty good about that. But then you get to this one and you're like, whoa, a lot of these words are like, what is a Mughal mausolea, right? Which it's just like the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is a mausolea. Or what is Dev Shirme? Well, then you know what you should do is you should go to Heimler's history and watch his 3.2 video. You know what I mean? Like that's what I would do. So I would use this as a checklist to just be like, okay, where do I need to go back and refresh my memory? And then, yeah, for the specific parts of the test, just practice them. Like get a practice test book, get Princeton Review or whatever, and do as many multiple choice practices as you can. For the DBQs, you can go back and look at past exams. You literally can like Google, AP World past exam, and there'll be a whole list of like every DBQ they've ever given. And they'll actually give like sample essays and stuff that you can look at. On my YouTube channel, I've just like last Saturday, actually not on mine, but last Saturday on the Marco Learning YouTube channel, I just wrote a DBQ live. So you can go watch that. And I'm going to do more of those on here. But again, if you just want to go see a bunch of questions, like you can go back and see, like I can go back to the year I graduated high school and be like, okay, well, what was the DBQ the year I graduated high school? If you're doing math, I'm 33. And you can go and pull up and you'll actually see the test booklet that they got in 2006, right? And you can scroll down and see, okay, well, what was the DBQ? Oh, it was about the global flow of silver. It was the one I was just talking about. And so you can go and see like, okay, what were the documents they got? And so again, if you're worried about like the DBQ especially, you don't have to write a million DBQs. but you could outline a bunch of them. You could pull up old DBQs and then just be like, okay, well, can I come up with an outline and a thesis statement? And if so, then great. And then move on and do it with another one. So again, do not worry too much. Make sure that you're following. I have put out a lot of resources that I think will help with a lot of questions in the chat before. I have videos from last year that walk through every single part of the rubric for the DBQ. So there's a whole video on context, a whole video on, thesis statements, whatever. But also, keep in mind that I'm posting daily review videos on TikTok. So I've just finished unit 5 and I'm moving on to unit 6, daily 60-second videos. And I'm gonna be posting a lot more resources. Like if I post something new on my website, I let people know about it through Instagram. And then make sure that you're subscribed to this YouTube channel, because I'll do these lives, but I'm also gonna be posting other videos. I'm gonna post one soon where I write an SAQ section. I just pull up a sample SAQ section and I do all 3 of them in the 40 minutes. I'm going to do another one where I just write an LEQ for the people that are taking the paper test. So make sure that you're subscribed and that you're following, just so that you can see as we put out more resources. So, okay, y'all are going to be fine, right? Stick it out, stick with me, trust me. And then make sure you have on your calendar for next Wednesday. We're going to be going over units 5 and 6. So we're going to be talking about the revolutions, industrialization, imperialism, all that good stuff. And thank you for helping each other out in the chat. Thank you for answering each other's questions. We're making a little nerd club here that I'm really excited about. So if you have any questions in between now and then, you can DM me on Instagram. I'll do my best to respond. But thanks y'all for joining. Make sure that you like this video if you thought it was helpful. And I will see y'all next week or maybe sooner, depending on how much time I have.